Hi guys, it's Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zickery of Space Command. But also I'm known as Mark Zickery, author of the Twilight Zone Companion. And at this upcoming Christmas, the new edition of the Twilight Zone Companion will be coming out with many, many more photographs, 100 pages of new text, audio and video links, all sorts of stuff. So I've been thinking a lot about the Twilight Zone lately, and great show, still holds up, still works. You can get the Blu-ray. I talked for 30 hours on the Blu-ray, 52 episode commentaries. But here's what I'm going to talk about today. I've been thinking about Rod Serling and Donald Trump, and what Rod might make of Donald Trump. He would certainly be amazed at Donald Trump being president. Rod would be in his 90s today if he were still alive, and we all wish, of course, that he were. He was an amazing man, unique. He died at 50, way too early, way too early. And of course, now in the world of 550 TV series and scripted and comedy, drama, all of this, he would have an amazing opportunity to write exactly the kind of show he wrote. Because when Twilight Zone was canceled, there were only 3 networks, and if you pissed off those 3 guys who headed those 3 networks, that was pretty much it for you working in TV, which is by and large what happened with Rod. And he had less and less autonomy, less and less ability to say what he wanted to say and do the kind of shows he wanted to do. But now, if he were doing Twilight Zone now, my gosh, he would have a fertile field. Twilight Zone would be on Netflix, and he would have total ability to write and say what he would want to write and say. And I'm sure with Trump in the office of president, Rod would have a lot to say. So the question becomes, can we look at Twilight Zone and get some clues as to what Rod would say and what Rod would think about President Trump? And again, I know that some people out there are fans of Trump and supporters of Trump. And again, I'm not I'm not trying to piss you guys off, but I just want to kind of observe what Rod Serling, one of our great writers and great icons, would have thought of Donald Trump and would have said about Donald Trump based on his work, on Rod's work. So, first of all, it's very interesting to think about the time that Rod wrote in, because Twilight Zone debuted in 1959. It ran through 1964, 5 seasons and 156 episodes. Rod wrote 92 of them himself. Amazing. Many of those were original scripts. Some were adaptations of short stories, and etc. And Rod was definitely a huge liberal and supporter of civil rights, supporter of human rights, and this is obvious, very obvious in his work. When I was going through his scrapbooks, researching the Twilight Zone Companion in my early 20s, I came across a photo of Rod with Martin Luther King, and of course they knew each other, and I'm sure were fans of each other's works. So here's the thing about Rod that's very interesting, and politically, in terms of now and in terms of then. He was in extremely dire times politically. The 1950s and early 60s. This was not a time of make America great again. This was not a time that many people were enjoying. I was going to say we're enjoying the fruits of America. If you were middle class, if you were in a union and working a union job, you'd be doing okay. But in terms of civil rights, all the newscasters were white. Most of the actors on TV and in the movies were white. There were a few exceptions. Sidney Poitier was a movie star, and Harry Belafonte was a popular singer. Nat King Cole was a popular singer. Lena Horne. But by and large, it was still time coming out of segregation, coming out of lynchings, trying to get the voting rights bill passed, all of that. Kennedy was assassinated during the run of Twilight Zone, and we were coming off the blacklist. One of the reasons, interestingly enough, that Rod Serling was not blacklisted, as liberal as he was that he was hugely anti-totalitarian, and whether it was fascism or communism, Rod was strongly opposed to it, and so he was never someone drawn to communism. And I think this is one of the things that was marked in his work and was clear in his work. He was very strongly state imposition on freedom of the individual. Rod was very strongly in favor of the individual, and so that allowed him to, and so by the late 1950s, he was the top writer working in TV, very successful. He ultimately over the course of his career, he would win 6 Emmys, he'd win the Peabody, the Hugo Awards, etc. But let's talk again back to politics. What lessons can we see from his work that would be germane to the modern day? Well, Rod would certainly be surprised by tweeting, and the internet and instantaneous news and 24-hour news and all of these things. He would be astonished that someone like Donald Trump could be in the presidency. I think because Rod was a voice for authenticity, integrity, honor, being appropriate, being respectful. You can see. I mean, when you see Rod on camera, you're seeing who that guy was. You're seeing what he stood for. You get a sense of a man with strong moral convictions who means what he says and really follows up on it. And so he would be very alarmed. He always spoke out against phonies and frauds. For instance, one person he would constantly inveigh against was John Wayne, because he felt that John Wayne was an arch conservative, and he would mouth these things. And Rod, who had fought in World War II, would always say that John Wayne played a soldier, but wasn't actually serving in World War II. And during World War II, the greatest injury that John Wayne could have had inflicted upon him was being hit by a flying starlet. So Rod certainly was someone to puncture people's balloons and speak out against things that he thought were wrong. But let's look at the Twilight Zone episodes and talk about that in terms of the political scene. Well, I think in terms of human rights and the right of the individual and the right of diversity in our society, the right of people to accept others who aren't like them, Eye of the Beholder is the great episode that speaks to that. It's a woman in a hospital bed who's waiting to learn if the final surgery has made her look normal. And if she's not made normal, the state is going to insist after this number of surgeries that she's going to be sent off to a reservation to be segregated among those of her kind, those who aren't normal, quote unquote, so that she will not be seen or be part of the mainstream culture. And Rod is very clear about how wrong he thinks that is, that he thinks that people who are different from us need to be among us. They have equal rights to our rights, and they are not different from us. They are the same as us, no matter what they look like. And it's a very, very powerful piece, and speaks not only for disabled rights, but also for the rights of any minority, anyone who is different. Also, a lot of people don't know that Rod was Jewish, and this also spoke to why, he felt that it was very important that we support religions of different, of different stripes, that religious rights, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech were vital and had to be protected, had to be maintained. He was constantly going up against censors, constantly going up against the powers that be, and he was no fan of Richard Nixon. And so beyond that, another episode that would speak to Rod's opinions that again relates to the modern day and the attempts by some in the government to limit the rights of others, limit the religious rights of others, and limit those who we associate with and who are considered quote unquote Americans and who are considered us, would be the obsolete man. And this again takes place in a totalitarian society of the future where a librarian is deemed obsolete, and the state has the power to erase him. And again, it's Rod writing about that, why it's important to respect everyone, why it's important to not see the government as having the right to strip us of our rights. And and so again, watching that episode, you get a very strong sense of why the overreaching hand of government is very wrong, and particularly when it limits speech, when it limits what we can read, what we can think, what we can see, who we can be. And again, watching that episode reminds us of many things that are important in the current moment. And then, I've been thinking about other Twilight Zones that might be germane to this, and surprisingly, one that I think is germane is a great hour-long episode, the Twilight Zone, that Rod wrote in the fourth season. In the fourth season, Twilight Zone was expanded to an hour from a half hour, and there were 18 episodes made, and they were varying quality, but there were still some great episodes. And the great one that Rod wrote that year was called On Thursday We Leave for Home, and it's about a leader on a colony ship has crashed on a barren world, and James Whitmore plays their leader, de facto leader, who has kept them together over many years. And then finally a rescue ship comes, and he shifts from being someone who is supportive of them and has kept them alive to someone who is desperate to hold on to power and sees that his power will vanish if they actually all go home to Earth. and he starts lying to them and telling them whatever will feed their fear, to try and keep them there on the planet, so he can keep power, so he can stay in charge of them. And it ultimately leads to a tragic end, or at least a very sad ending. It's a great episode. I highly recommend it. But in terms of leadership, it really shows what a leader who's just trying to hold on to power can do and say if he's no longer connected to the well-being of his constituency, and that the truth becomes a very malleable thing when a leader doesn't feel a core responsibility to those he's supposed to protect and look after, and when power is the main pursuit. So again, I think in the era of Trump, that's a very useful episode to watch. And it's funny because the one thing also is, with the Vietnam War starting up, with Kennedy being assassinated, with so many things happening, the civil rights movement, all of this during Twilight Zone, political turmoil, you name it. And of course, one can say that many of the kids who grew up watching Twilight Zone, learning from Rod's lessons, became the hippies, became the counterculture that would emerge in the late 60s. And so they were the children of the Twilight Zone. They all because this is back when there were only 3 networks, so everyone was watching everything. And after Twilight Zone went off the air in 64, it ran in syndication. And so in the afternoons, kids could come home from school and watch it every weekday. And so that, I think, was a hugely important learning ground for many, many kids, including, of course, myself. So, Rod stood against anything that would erase humanity, erase the individual. There's a lesser episode called The Brain Center at Whipple's that inveighs against automation when workers are thrown out and discarded. And of course, there's other episodes that Rod didn't write of Twilight Zone, such as Number 12 Looks Just Like You, which is about, again, another episode about the horrors of conformity, mental and physical conformity. So these are all things one can watch, but sadly there are many differences between now and the early 60s, and Rod would have commented on them, written about them. I would have been fascinated to see what he would have had to say, and what he would have written, and what wonders he would have created now, talking about the current day. And also, by the way, in terms of Russia, because Russia is very much in the news and in people's thoughts in terms of how it interfered with our elections and our history now. Rod, of course, was very anti-totalitarian and would have been very outspoken against the current Russian regime, just as he was outspoken against the Soviet regime in many of the Twilight Zone episodes. The Whole Truth is another episode that he wrote, again, a lesser one, where someone there's a haunted car that forces people to tell the truth, and so a used car dealership can't get rid of it, and finally they sell it to Nikita Khrushchev, which is a joke because Khrushchev, of course, often in the public sphere was not telling the truth. Pravda was not telling the truth, and so again, this has resonances in the current era. And but again, I think the main thing about Twilight Zone that keeps it current, keeps it fresh, because we can watch those episodes over and over again, and even if we know the capper, the twist, we can watch them again and again. And why is that? Because there is truth in those episodes, a great heart, a great feeling of what's right and what's wrong. It takes place in a world in which people rise to their best selves or their worst selves, and what happens to them is based on how brave and how honorable and how loyal and how kind they're willing to be. And so there, you see this in episode after episode after episode. And I think the larger lesson that we can get from Twilight Zone now is that it's very important for us to be courageous. It's very important for us to reach out to others. It's very important for us to be authentic, our authentic selves and our kindest selves. Compassion is a power in the world, and Rod saw that, and Rod was a great advocate for that. And of course, there are Twilight Zone episodes like To Serve Man, where you can say, people end up pretty badly in that one. But so if Rod came across a story that was great, he would do it if it had a great capper. But even in that episode, you can see that people are falling for a lie, and it's leading them down a path to great disaster. And because again, Rod felt very strongly that we need to look clearly at things and not believe what we're told, but really look under what's being told and see what the real truth is. And that's important then and important now. I think Rod would be very pleased at many things. Certainly he would have been very pleased that Obama became president. I think he'd be alarmed and appalled that Trump is president now. But he would know, as we all know, that thank God we live in a democracy. Thank God there are term limits on presidents, and that so that things will change and change and change, and we just have to kind of reach out to others and be our true selves and be kind and and fight for all of us to be healthy and find and fulfilled lives. And so that's sort of the main things I've been mulling over. And I mean, thank God Rod Serling wrote in a medium that has lasted. If he had been writing in the 19th century instead of the 20th century, there might be some books that he had written, but you certainly wouldn't be able to turn on a TV or watch it on a phone. That's another thing he didn't predict, that you can see these wonderful works of art that he created so easily, so readily now. But I think he would still be as much an outspoken voice of the people, voice of the individual, voice of humanity now as he was then. And his work still lasts and still teaches us very important lessons. And so that's it for now. So, Mr. Sci-Fi, you can subscribe to my Mr. Sci-Fi channel on YouTube. We're posting regularly, and I think what I would suggest now more than anything is just go seek out the Twilight Zone, watch one of your favorite episodes or an episode you haven't seen, and you'll be well rewarded. So that's it for now. Talk again soon. Bye-bye.